And here we go. This is the nervous system. For some people, they love this system because we're getting into things like behavior and the effects of drugs and the brain and Alzheimer's. So it can be a really interesting unit and one that you'll be doing a lot with in terms of assessment. So in this video, we're going to look specifically at major functions and divisions of the nervous system, types of cells found, the parts of a neuron, and what is myelination. In future videos, we'll consider things like drug dependence, parts of the brain, and other parts of the nervous system. So let's begin with this idea. First, I don't have it on the slide, but the nervous system is just one of two systems that actually is involved in lots of communication activities. The nervous system is the one that we most associate with impulses and fast responses. The other system we'll discuss later in the course, and that's the endocrine system. And rather than using electrical signals, the endocrine system uses hormones. But we'll focus on the nervous system while we're here. So major structures that we associate with the nervous system include the brain and spinal cord, the 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Cranial nerves are nerves that arise directly from the brain, come from the brain like the olfactory nerve or the trigeminal or facial or hypoglossal nerves. There's actually 12, of course, and we'll discuss those in a little more detail what they do. But since they come directly from the brain, we kind of put them in their own category. There's also 31 pairs of peripheral nerves. These are nerves that come off the spinal cord, and we'll discuss those in more detail as well. And I threw ganglia on here because ganglia are collections of nerve cells that are found outside of the CNS, the central nervous system, and those will be clearer to you a little bit later, but I want to put them up here as belonging to the nervous system. What you see in our brief diagram of this is the brain and spinal cord here, and those are labeled as being part of or being consisting of the central nervous system. And we'll discuss that in more detail in just a second. Everything else that any other nerves that come to or go or come from or go to the CNS are considered peripheral. Peripheral means to the side of, so if you have a peripheral for your computer, it's kind of stuck to the side of your computer. Peripheral are going to be everything but the brain and spinal cord. So this consists of some of the neurons that are going to send signals to the CNS and some that are going to carry signals away from the CNS. So while we're here, and because it's the next slide, let's look at the major divisions of the nervous system, and this might help you organize in your brain a little bit better the divisions of the responsibilities of the nervous system. So let me get my slide back here. Here we go. So what are the parts or the divisions of the nervous system? We've already addressed the two most pressing ones, I guess, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The CNS is an integration system. This is where impulses are going to be sent to or from for processing. If you step on a tack, information is sent to your brain, and your brain can help you understand why that's a bad idea to do that again. It's a little more involved than that. But obviously the CNS is going to be involved in memory storage and response and reactions and learning. The peripheral nervous system is for transmitting information to and from the CNS. As I like to say, the peripheral nervous system doesn't make the decisions. It carries information to the CNS and carries information from the CNS. If you have a job where the boss makes all the decisions, you give the boss information, the boss tells you what we're going to do, and then the reaction goes back, and you have to carry that reaction out. Okay, to continue on then, as we mentioned, the CNS is the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system actually has two divisions as well. One is the somatic nervous system, and these aren't separate nervous systems, but fibers, nerves, neurons that carry information specifically for. So the somatic carries information specifically for and to your muscles. When you decide to move a muscle, information travels from the spinal cord to through a motor neuron to your muscles so that you can contract your muscles. So the somatic nervous system is voluntary control. These are the parts that you are allowed to control, you're allowed to move. The autonomic nervous system is involuntary. And it might seem odd that you would have an involuntary part of your nervous system, but there are things that you have to regulate and control that you yourself are not responsible enough to do. So the autonomic nervous system takes care of that. Things like regulating the diameter of your blood vessels to how intensely your intestines are squeezing on food. These are things that are going to be controlled autonomically. And you should hear the word automatic in that term, autonomic. And that's going to be this is going to be the reaction response, or the response that actually controls those glands and organs and other parts that you do not control. Even within this, we can see two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. We'll delve into these a little bit more later. I think people tend to think of the sympathetic as a gas pedal, as it accelerates all these parts, it mobilizes everything, and the parasympathetic slows everything down. And that's actually not quite correct, not totally correct. But if you want to, in general terms, think of them as these are going to be neurons or reactions that oppose each other, that would be accurate. So you will see in many cases sympathetic neurons and parasympathetic neurons go to and from the actual same organ. One of them will be involved in one reaction and the other will be involved in the opposite reaction. So let's look at the two types of cells that we associate with the nervous system, and there's some subtypes we'll get to in a moment. But the major types are neurons and neuroglial cells. And we mentioned this when we were looking at nerve tissue way back in histology. Neurons are going to be those cells that actually transmit nervous impulses or electrical impulses. And you see one here, this large one. These are the grandiose ones, the important ones to some people because they carry electrical information. They're the stars. And yes, they are important, and they do indeed carry electrical information to and from parts of the body. But without neuroglial cells, they couldn't function. Neuroglial cells are going to be those cells that are going to be in supporting roles, and we'll look at some examples in a moment. And those are all the little ones you see up here. These are all neuroglial cells, which are going to be important for the metabolism and maintenance of nerve cells, of the neurons. Okay, so let's start with a neuron and look at its parts, and then we'll work our way to neuroglial cells. The three major regions you should see with a neuron, and you see it here, it comes all the way down, all the way to here. Neurons can be quite large, not in size, but in length. You can have a neuron that goes all the way from your spinal cord to your big toe. So let's look at how neurons are put together. Neurons actually have these three major regions. They have this part up here, all this branching part here is going to be the dendrites. They look like little trees, and they actually are going to be interfacing with other neurons or other receptors. So this is the input of information for a neuron. The next region you're going to find a focus here is the cell body. There it is, the cell body, which is going to be this whole part here. And the cell body is going to be like any other cell, more or less, that you know of. It's going to have a nucleus, it's going to have protein production, it's going to have metabolism, it's going to have mitochondria, it's going to synthesize things. So it's going to have regions that you would associate with a cell. And you see here it has a receptive region, which we'll get to in just a second. But this whole part here is the cell body. Now, for receptive region, they're referring specifically to that axon hillock, this little region down here. This is going to be, yes, for reception, but also for what we're going to term here integration. We'll see a little bit later how a neuron decides whether or not to fire, whether to send a signal down its axon or not. And the axon hillock is sort of a mini brain, if you will, of a neuron where it's going to process information and let the neuron know whether or not we should be firing. Nesal bodies are going to be regions we'll talk about in a second. I just want to point them out here. There's going to be these little dark inclusions, And again, we'll focus on them more a little bit later. I just want you to be aware that they are in the cell body. And then finally, this whole long skinny part that extends from the cell body, this is the axon. Axons carry impulses away from the cell body. And again, axon, axon away. Uh, that is generally the case. There is some research being done to suggest that some impulses travel opposite direction. Don't worry about that. For our purposes, everything we know about physiology is that impulses travel from the neuron along the axon in that direction. A couple more things to note. You'll notice if you look very carefully, it's not the best slide to see this, but there's these little white beads that appear on the axon, and these are Schwann cells, and we'll talk about them more in just a moment. There are some gaps between the Schwann cells called nodes of Ranvier, and we will get into that when we get into how impulses travel along axons. But just want you to be aware these are the gaps between Schwann cells. This whole thing makes up a myelin sheath, and I'll give you that term in just a moment. I want to point out one more thing before we go, that even though you have this long, skinny extension, there actually are mechanisms to transport some materials from this direction to that direction, and that is called the retrograde pathway. So some materials do travel that direction. So unlike impulses, they travel this way, follow the cursor, they travel back that direction. I mention this only because there are some diseases like polio and herpes and the tetanus toxin that have figured this out and actually travel backward and cause damage to our neurons because they're traveling in a unauthorized, in a way they're not supposed to travel. So this is the neuron itself. You have billions of these. You have 100 billion alone in just your brain. And they're going to be tightly connected and integrated and working together. Okay. As we move on, I wanted you to be aware of this basic schematic of how impulses travel in the body. They always travel from a sensory mechanism to the CNS, to the brain and spinal cord, and then from the CNS out via a motor output. So I point this out because since impulses only travel one direction, they only travel from dendrite to cell body to axon, you can't have the same neuron carry information to the CNS and then back from the CNS. So you're going to have separate neurons to handle this. Now, we'll introduce this term here that you've heard of, nerve. What is a nerve? A nerve is going to be a collection or a bundle of neurons that carry information either to or from, or in some cases mixed, in a single connective tissue wrapping. Now that sounds like I'm contradicting myself because I thought we just said impulses only travel in one direction. They do. You may have, and I won't try to draw this, but you may have in a single nerve cell, you may have impulses that travel that way and some that travel this way within the same nerve tissue, but they're traveling on separate neurons. Just like if you imagine on I-40, there is a westbound and eastbound highway. They're not supposed to travel on the same highway, they're traveling in opposite directions. So impulses travel from a sensory neuron to the CNS, brain and spinal cord, where we figure out what to do with that sensory information, and then we send out a response. In this case, headless guy sees a glass of water, sensory information is communicated to the brain and spinal cord, out via a motor neuron. It's going to be a signal to make his muscles work for him to then pick up that glass of water. In a way, it's kind of like a feedback loop, right? There's going to be a sensory or reception, there's going to be an integration, and there's going to be a response. The big difference here, of course, is there's no homeostatic norm, or he's not trying to resist anything or trying to cause anything to happen. This is just the feedback cycle of you sense, you integrate, you react, you sense, you integrate, react. Okay. Now let's look at some neuroglial cells, and then we'll wrap up with some myelination. The term neuroglia means glue. And for a long time, we thought that these cells simply glued together or held together neurons. And now we recognize that these cells actually have some very distinct functions. For example, astrocytes are going to be neuroglial cells that are found only in the CNS, only in the brain in this case, and they help form the blood-brain barrier. If you look very carefully at this, you see this thing here, this purple thing is a capillary, and it's wrapped by all of these pieces of the astrocytes that are wrapping all around it. And if you notice, there's very little space for anything to get out of. It's like wrapping something in insulation. So if blood is traveling to the brain, most things cannot leave the capillaries because the astrocytes are protecting the brain from it. Thinking about all of the nasty stuff that could be floating around in your in your blood, and let's focus on pathogens for a second. You don't want stuff just getting out of your bloodstream and then infecting your brain. That'd be very difficult to get at. So the astrocytes help maintain this blood-brain barrier. I have this picture over here on the side. This just shows you an astrocytoma. This is a brain tumor. I point this out because neurons are not that mitotic. And if most of the brain is made of neurons, 100 billion of them, then how can someone develop brain cancer? They develop brain cancer not necessarily from the neurons, but from the supporting cells. In this case, an astrocytoma is going to be a brain cancer that's caused by astrocytes having an irregular or uncontrolled cell division. Okay, ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are going to be found in the brain ventricles, the brain spaces, and we'll see those a little bit later, but they help form cerebral spinal fluid. This is the fluid that's going to wash all down the spinal cord and all around the brain and provide nutrition for it. So these are, again, only going to be in the CNS. Microglial cells are going to be in the CNS, and they help protect the CNS from disease. So think of them kind of like the white blood cells that we find everywhere else. They're going to be in the brain. They have sort of special access, special authorization to be there, and they actually can detect pathogens and help destroy them. Oligodendrocytes are going to be cells found again in the CNS that produce this myelin sheath. We talked about Schwann cells a minute ago, making this covering around the axon. These make the covering around the neurons in the brain and spinal cord. They're not going to be in the peripheral nervous system. Finally, just about, the Schwann cells are the cells that we've previously seen that do make that white covering around the neuron, the axon specifically, in the peripheral nervous system. And we'll discuss what they do in just one second. Finally, there's another type here, satellite cells, and I mentioned it up here. These are peripheral nervous system cells. What they do is not exactly clear. Some people argue they have a slight immune system role. Some other people argue they have a slight repair role. We're not quite sure what satellite cells specifically do. Okay. This slide is getting at a little bit of why we have this fatty covering that oligodendrocytes make, or Schwann cells make. This fatty covering is called myelination. And what we're trying to show you here is this is the axon. This is that long extension that comes out of a neuron's cell body. You can develop, because of Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system or oligodendrocytes in the CNS, you can develop this kind of jelly roll kind of covering that completely surrounds a part of an axon. The reason that we produce this is myelination actually helps insulate the axon and it speeds the nerve impulse. We'll consider a disease where this myelin sheath gets damaged, and when it does, we see irregular or slower speeds of impulses. So we know myelination is involved in speeding impulses on axons in the central nervous, in the CNS, and in the PNS. Finally, when we talk about gray and white matter, we're actually talking about myelination. Wherever you have white matter, you're going to have myelination. That's where the neurons are covered in the myelination, either in this case by oligodendrocytes. The gray matter is where they're not covered. The Niesel bodies that we find in neurons actually give neurons a slightly darker appearance. So if you have a lot of neurons that are together that are not myelinated, that's called gray matter. And gray you can spell however you want to. Gray matter is going to be non-myelinated neurons. Finally, this is kind of cool. We don't see this too often. What kind of section is this? This is an oblique section. We don't see that too often, but in this case, it actually was the best section to see myelination and non-myelinated fibers. Okay, that's your introduction to the nervous system. Again, make sure you know what the astrocytes do. All the neuronal cells do. Make sure you understand the parts of a neuron and what those regions are, the cell body, the dendrites, the axon, and understand the divisions of an organization of the nervous system. That's it. Thanks.